Hello everyone, it's a privilege to present to you. My presentation is called The Transforming Role and Benefits of Online Platforms in the EFL Classroom Before and During Emergency Remote Teaching. My name is Stachus Peter Tu, and I'm from Hiroshima Bunkyo University. So I first like to set the scene and give a little bit of background on the situation I was in for 2019, 2020, and 2021. So within this period of time, I've been at 3 different universities in Hiroshima, and teaching the EFL courses there has really been a privilege. And during this time, there were so many things that came up before the pandemic, when it started, and also as we're progressing currently today. I used online platforms for my research, and this is something I've been doing since 2018. I started out with 2 platforms, which I'll talk about in the slides coming up, but that's the main focus for the presentation today: is how do online platforms help us, and how are online platforms structured in a way in the classroom to make our lives easier, and how do they influence our teaching today. So a really big focus of my presentation is teaching and research pressures, of course. And so my personal story about how the events that occurred because of the pandemic, how have online platforms, or the use of these online platforms, benefited me in this aspect, because those pressures are very, very high, I would say, in the university environment, especially during the pandemic. And so that's sort of the background. So just to give a little bit of background on the pressures of the university environment, I'd like to talk about these 3 things, which I think are pretty universal amongst those who work in the university environment. The first one being service, which is teaching, community duties, and volunteer work. If you're part-timing, community duties might not be as big of a thing, but the other 2, teaching and volunteer work, absolutely take up the most in this category. Qualifications, so degrees, certifications, and licenses. For a lot of people who are lecturers in the university environment, they might be pursuing their PhD oftentimes. Finishing up their PhD is often the situation for many who work in the university environment. And any licenses that you might be pursuing as well, these are things you want to be putting in your CV. I would say this is also a huge pressure for many of us. So research is another big pressure, absolutely a massive pressure, I would say, in the university environment, which is publications, presentations, and grants. And of course, it might vary university. These 3, I would say, are they vary quite a bit depending on the situation you're in. However, I would say each one of these 3 things, which I've identified as the holy trinity of pressures of the university environment, are by themselves take up all of your time, essentially. So it's very difficult to balance these 3. It really is a juggling act to balance these 3 even when things are not doing things are not in a pandemic situation. So when we're talking about reducing pressures that I mentioned in the previous slide, and trying to increase our efficiency, we have to talk about a really big thing, which I would say is time and energy. And this is something that really is what controls all the stress that you feel from those 3 pressures. And it really comes down to how often you feel in the zone. In the zone is really limited to certain times of the day. It's needed in order to produce good work. It's basically any time that you feel that you are at your peak efficiency. For myself, it would be in the morning, when I'm able to, create ideas, understand things better, write better quality writing. And this is not the case when I'm getting back from work. And oftentimes it's very limited to certain times of the day. It's very different for different people. But this is something that we'll focus on a little bit when we're talking about the situations that I was in. So the online platforms are structured as discussion forums, And specifically, I want students to practice written discussion. Within these discussion forums, they can learn how to hedge disagreement, so how to disagree with others while mitigating their statements that might be very direct, and also achieve more balanced participation. So there's been research that has shown that students within electronic communication, if they're shyer, they oftentimes will participate more in an online forum because it's it's not face-to-face, and they might feel more comfortable doing it online. It's a minimized instructor's role, so we're always looking for ways to make it easier for us to promote peer-to-peer, student-to-student interaction, where the teacher is not the center of the classroom. And it's a reduction of parallelism. And parallelism is where lower level students will spend time in a conversation to creating what they're about to say, or what they're about to say, rather than listening to the other person speak. So it's a situation where you're not actually listening to the other person, you're creating or crafting what you're about to say in order to say it. And so it happens with a lot of lower level learners. And when you're in discussion forums, that's not the case, because you're able to read and even translate what is being written to you and respond in a way that doesn't eliminate your ability to listen to the other person. So it's less of a one-way thing that parallelism unfortunately creates. So in many ways, discussion forums are very beneficial in these ways. The first online platform that I used was Google Classroom. So to list out some of the positives first, students can use their university email addresses. Most universities already have a subscription to G Suite for Education. Students are able to directly use this to access Google Classroom. It's very easy to add students via their email addresses associated with the university. I was using this before 2020, and so in fact, when the pandemic started, I was already used to using this, but it's very easy to receive approval from the university to use Google Classroom. It's made for education. So the biggest positives are also that you can use it to collect assignments and manage grades. It's overall just a very big time saver. So it's a learner management system. So for a lot of teachers who are looking to manage their students and do anything related to education, I think most people have touched upon Google Classroom at some point during the pandemic. And so what I would say is the only negative in Google Classroom, of course, this is not a complete list, but I would say the biggest one, if you're creating a discussion forum, is that students must post something before they can see other people's opinions or what they have posted. Because what I see as Google Classroom, because it's a learning management system, it's not created to be a discussion forum. And that is something that is mitigated with other platforms, which I'll talk about. So Line is absolutely my favorite out of the two, Google Classroom and Line. I would say Line is my favorite because it is, to list out some of the positives, it's the most popular smartphone messaging platform. Students check it very frequently. You can use it very easily to create group or one-to-one discussions. It's easy to manage multiple discussions as well. So those of you who have used Line before know that group and one-to-one discussions are an option. So just creating one-to-one discussions that you can manage with the students, or even creating large class size discussions with the group function is very easy with Line. And this is by far the easiest to use for creating discussion forums. And the only negative about Line is that it's using students' personal accounts. So although this is something that needs to be mitigated, and of course, depending on the university, the situation might be different. Students are able to limit the private information they can show to others in their personal accounts, and so this is typically not a huge issue. 2019 is the first year that we'll focus on, which was the face-to-face classroom. During this time, the discussion forum was optional, and most of the student communication was during class. And so I personally have a preference for students communicating face-to-face when it comes to speaking classes, because it's much easier to guide them. But I would say this is definitely a big positive of face-to-face. Although there are many good points about the face-to-face classroom, these are 4 things that I would say are negatives that I felt have always struck me as not very good, things that can be improved upon. The first one being imbalanced participation. So for shyer students, it's sometimes very difficult for them to communicate with their peers in class. It's simply because some of them feel closer to other students. Some students have less friends in the class, or their personality is just more quiet, and it's hard to encourage that participation for some students. And so this is always a very big question, I think, for many teachers. And also, it's very hard for students to make up work. For classes that are speaking based, or any EFL class, it's very hard for students to make up work when they're gone, especially when points are given during class. And so for those students, if they miss a class, their grade can significantly be affected, especially if participation points are part of it. On the teacher end, commute times and things being paper-based are 2 things that I've always seen as being not very positive things. So commute times, especially when I was part-timing, was very difficult to deal with because you had to go to many different universities. When I was teaching at a total of 3 universities, during this time it was very difficult to maintain a schedule that didn't make me too exhausted when I was commuting. And also everything being paper-based in Japan makes it so that it's very, very difficult to manage multiple assignments being handed to you, especially when you want to convert them eventually into electronic form. So these are some things that I think were mitigated by things that I did during the pandemic with the online discussion forum. So in 2020 was the beginning of online courses. This is when I ramped up the role of the discussion forum. All student-to-student communication was via online platforms, and so during this time there's just simply no face-to-face. And there was a lot more one-to-one attention given for students. I was able to communicate with students via written messages in a way that was much easier than waiting for them to come to me during class. During face-to-face courses, this was not possible because you had to typically wait for students to come to class. They wouldn't have the habit of checking emails. And so because the pandemic made it so students had to check their emails or had to check these platforms very frequently, it made it so that I could communicate with students via Line or Google Classroom very easily, and they would respond very quickly as well. So there's also a record of everything. This made grading and keeping track of everything during teaching very much easier, and especially research related to discussion forums also was benefited by this as well. There's reduced commute and things were paperless. It goes without saying that this makes it much easier for your time. I think these 2 things by themselves already save you a lot of time. So there are negatives though for the online courses. For many of you, I think it's an experience that many of you have had. It's hard for students who have already struggled. Those who don't come to face-to-face courses very often probably will disappear during online courses. It's just a pattern that I've seen. And so you'll have missing in action students, those who simply disappear during online courses. It's not a huge majority. However, for students who already struggle in face-to-face, online courses are not conducive for these students. And so if you're teaching students who are having trouble during face-to-face, it's probably going to be even harder for them in online courses. So online courses, even if you incorporate discussion forums, these are things that are not going to be benefiting students who are already struggling. And so then again, just to add that caveat to everything, just to not paint a perfect picture for everything. 2021 was the gradual return to face-to-face classes. And so during this time, there's a copy of face-to-face classes online provided to students. This is very nice because students were able to see a copy of the class if they're gone. Student-to-student communication was in 2 forms, so it was via these online platforms or face-to-face. Oftentimes, very motivated students and even students who, were just a little bit interested in doing something outside of the class would participate not only in class, but also via online platforms. And, when they're in the online platforms, it's very easy to talk with each other because they're not, wearing masks. And also there's much less, fear of, the whole pandemic situation. And so one-to-one attention was given to students online. Of course, it was less so than when everything was online, but in this case, I was still able to communicate with them via messages because a lot of students had already gotten used to communicating with myself online by, just because they were checking their messages much more often. So it was much easier for students to make up work. And so because there was also an option for students to look at the copies of face-to-face class online, it was much easier for them to just look at what they missed instead of coming to me maybe 1 or 2 classes after they missed it. It definitely benefited shyer students. So shyer students oftentimes would participate much more in online platforms than they did face-to-face, simply because they were shyer face-to-face. The only bad thing about everything, by incorporating the online discussion forums, what I would say is it's difficult to maintain both a face-to-face and online version of the class. And so if you're trying to manage an online discussion forum, it's going to take up more of your time if it's not very streamlined in a way that is not taking too much of your time. Again, it's made to not be too supervised. However, if you're trying to maintain the online discussion forum in a very supervised manner, then it's probably going to take up more of your time. But I don't think that's typically the goal of the online discussion forum. It's made to be a more student-based, student-guided activity. So to wrap up everything, the 3 things which I see as the biggest positives of using online discussion forums, and especially using Line, is one-to-one attention given to students. They will check the messages very quickly, and you can communicate with them much more frequently if you need to. There's better submission of classwork because there is a copy of what was provided to students during face-to-face. They can check it themselves, and also they can make up work much quicker. There's much more time and flexibility for research, and so this one of the pillars of the stresses and pressures that I felt in the university environment is solved by a lot of these online discussion forums, because I don't have to worry too much about creating too many opportunities, other opportunities for students to pursue outside of the classroom. And so discussion forums was the way that the students were able to pursue kind of English practice outside of the classroom, and it didn't have to be a very different activity every single time. And so that definitely saved me a lot of time. So this is not all the benefits, but these are 3 that I see as the most significant. This is the biography. So for those of you who want to look more into what was talked about in the presentation, and also some recent publications that talk about the experience of teachers, feel free to do so. And I'd like to close the presentation by saying thank you to everyone who has helped out with the conference and given me this opportunity to present. It has definitely been a pleasure to talk with all of you. So thank you very much.